Most people think they know the story of the Crusades. It goes something like this. In 1095, a pope stood up in France and called for a holy war. Fired up by religious fanaticism, tens of thousands of European knights marched east, driven by greed for land and a hatred of Islam, to seize Jerusalem by the sword. For 2 centuries, Christians and Muslims fought a single, continuous religious war, a clean clash of civilizations, until the Europeans were finally driven out for good. It's the story behind 100 movies, 1,000 arguments on the internet, and more misplaced political rhetoric than almost any other period in medieval history. And here's the problem. Almost none of that is quite right. Not because the Crusades weren't real, weren't violent, weren't often justified with religious language that led to atrocities. They were, and we are not going to look away from that in this video. But the popular version compresses 200 years of tangled, contradictory, often bizarre history into a single myth, and that myth gets almost every important detail wrong. It wasn't one war. It wasn't only against Muslims. The Pope who started it all was responding to a request for help that never asked for what he ended up preaching. The first mass killing of the entire enterprise happened in Germany against Jews, hundreds of miles from any battlefield with Islam, and the church itself condemned it. The single most devastating sack of a city in the entire crusading era wasn't inflicted on a Muslim capital. It was inflicted on the greatest Christian city on earth by a Christian army in the name of the cross. And the men who marched east on the First Crusade were, by the best modern research, driven less by greed for land than by something almost the opposite: a costly, sincere, often financially ruinous religious devotion that modern audiences find much harder to believe than the cynical version. So let me take you back and rebuild this story properly, not to excuse the violence and not to romanticize it either, but to actually understand it in all its genuine, uncomfortable complexity. Because the true origin of the Crusades isn't a simple story about faith versus faith. It's a story about a desperate empire's plea for help, spiraling wildly out of anyone's control, about a fractured and divided Islamic world that didn't even initially register what was happening, about a pope trying to solve problems back home in Europe as much as problems in the Holy Land, and about 2 centuries of holy war that were fought as often against fellow Christians and European pagans as against any army of Islam. Before we go further, a word about how to hold this story, because it's one where people tend to reach for a clean verdict. Was it naked Western aggression against a peaceful Islamic world? Or was it a justified defensive response to centuries of Muslim conquest? You'll find serious historians and popular commentators arguing both extremes with total confidence. And both of those confident stories are, in their own way, oversimplifications. The honest history is messier than either. It involves real religious conviction and real cynicism, sometimes in the very same person. It involves violence committed by all sides, against all sides, including against their own people. Understanding that complexity isn't about finding someone to blame less. It's about seeing what actually happened. Because the propaganda version, on every side of this argument, has been doing real damage in the real world for 900 years. Let's start where the story is usually told to begin, and then immediately complicate it. The year is 1071, and a Byzantine army marches into eastern Anatolia to confront a rising power called the Seljuk Turks, a Turkic dynasty that had swept out of Central Asia, converted to Sunni Islam, and carved out a vast new empire stretching from Persia to the borders of Byzantine territory. At a place called Manzikert, the Byzantine army suffers one of the worst defeats in the empire's 700-year history. Their emperor is captured. And in the chaotic years that follow, the Seljuks and various Turkish warlords pour into the Anatolian heartland that had supplied the Byzantine Empire with most of its soldiers, its grain, and its tax revenue for centuries. It is, by any measure, a catastrophe, arguably the single greatest blow the Byzantine state had ever suffered. Now, a talented general named Alexios Komnenos claws his way onto the Byzantine throne in 1081 and spends over a decade trying to stabilize an empire that is bleeding territory on multiple fronts at once, fighting Normans in the west and Turks in the east with a treasury and an army that can no longer do both. And here's where the story most people are told begins, but with a detail that changes everything. In March of 1095, Alexios sends ambassadors to a church council in the Italian town of Piacenza, where they appeal to Pope Urban II for help. And what they are asking for is not a holy war to reconquer Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not even mentioned. What Alexios wants is Western mercenaries, professional soldiers who could serve essentially as hired muscle under Byzantine command to help push the Turks back out of Anatolia. He had used exactly this kind of arrangement before. It was meant to be a targeted, limited request for military manpower, part of a long tradition of Byzantine emperors hiring Western knights. What Alexios got back 8 months later was something else entirely. In November of 1095, at another council in the French town of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood up and delivered one of the most consequential speeches in human history. And here's a detail that almost never makes it into the popular telling. We don't actually know exactly what he said. Not precisely. There is no surviving official transcript. No minutes taken down word for word in the room that day. What we have instead are several different written accounts, composed years later by chroniclers, and crucially, most of them were written after Jerusalem had already fallen in 1099, which means they were shaped with the benefit of hindsight, by writers who already knew how the story ended and were, consciously or not, crafting a founding myth for something that had already succeeded. The versions differ from each other. Some emphasize aiding fellow Christians in the East, some emphasize liberating Jerusalem specifically. Some put dramatic, vivid language into Urban's mouth describing atrocities against pilgrims that modern historians suspect were exaggerated or invented after the fact to justify what had already happened. So even the founding moment of the entire crusading movement, the single speech everyone thinks they know, survives to us not as history, but as something closer to legend, reconstructed retroactively by men with an agenda. What we can say with confidence is this: Urban took a narrow Byzantine request for mercenary reinforcements and transformed it into something categorically different. A mass, penitential armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem itself, open not just to professional soldiers, but to any Christian willing to take a vow, promising in return something the church had never quite offered in this form before: a plenary indulgence, a full remission of the punishment due for sin, for those who undertook the journey with the right intentions. And the reaction absolutely stunned him. He had probably expected a respectable response from the French nobility. What he got was mass hysteria, a continent-wide movement, tens of thousands of people from every level of society taking up the cross, selling their possessions, and marching east. And to understand why so many people responded with such overwhelming enthusiasm, you have to understand what was happening back in Europe, because the origin of the Crusades is not just a story about the East. It's just as much a story about a Western Christendom under enormous internal pressure, looking for somewhere to point its energy. The 11th century in Western Europe was, in a very real sense, a society organized around violence. Land was held by a warrior aristocracy trained from childhood in fighting, and with no professional standing armies and no strong central states in most of France and Germany, that violence had a habit of turning inward into endless local feuds, raiding, and private wars between neighboring lords. The church had spent decades trying to manage this problem through movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, essentially attempting to negotiate limits on when and against whom Christian knights were allowed to fight each other. It was a real, serious, and only partially successful effort at social control. Pope Urban himself, in the very same council at Clermont, spent time reaffirming exactly these kinds of truces before he ever mentioned the East. Multiple surviving accounts of his sermon include him explicitly framing the crusade as a way to redirect that violence outward. Let men who have been in the habit of wickedly fighting against their fellow Christians now fight a righteous war against the enemies of the faith. That is more or less the actual argument several chroniclers put in his mouth. Whether or not those are Urban's precise words, the underlying strategic logic is almost certainly real. This was, in part, a pressure release valve for a violently unstable continent, redirecting the aristocracy's endemic warfare toward a cause the church could sanctify and, crucially, control. There was also a deeper institutional context. The late 11th century was the era of what historians call the Gregorian Reform and the investiture controversy, a bitter, decades-long power struggle between the papacy and secular rulers, especially the Holy Roman Emperor, over who had ultimate authority in Christendom, the Pope or the King. Urban was a pope still fighting for legitimacy against a rival, imperially backed anti-pope, successfully launching and leading the largest mobilization of Christian warriors in European history would do more than help Byzantium. It would dramatically demonstrate and expand the practical authority of the papacy itself over the kings and knights of Europe, positioning the Pope, rather than any secular monarch, as the supreme commander of Christian society. None of this means Urban's religious motives were fake. Multiple lines of evidence suggest he was, by the standards of his office, a genuinely committed reformer. But it does mean that the First Crusade was never simply a spontaneous religious response to suffering in the East. It was also, from its very inception, deeply entangled with the internal politics, internal violence, and internal power struggles of Western Christendom itself. And there's one more piece of context almost never mentioned, because it complicates the idea that this was Christendom's first encounter with holy war against Islam. It wasn't. For decades before Claremont, the papacy had already been sponsoring and blessing military campaigns against Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula, part of what would later be called the Reconquista, and Christian forces had also recently seized Muslim Sicily. Urban himself, in letters written both before and after his famous speech, explicitly discussed the ongoing war in Spain as being on the same spiritual footing as the expedition to Jerusalem. And at one point, he specifically forbade Spanish knights from abandoning that Western front to go fight in the East. The First Crusade wasn't a bolt from the blue. It was the moment an existing, decades-old tradition of papally sanctioned holy war got redirected and massively scaled up toward a new and far more symbolically powerful target, the city where Christ himself had died. Now, once Urban's call went out, something happened that reveals just how little control the church actually had over the forces it had unleashed. And this is where we arrive at the part of the story that the heroic myth almost always leaves out entirely, because it is the ugliest chapter in the whole affair. And it happened before a single crusader had even reached the borders of the Byzantine Empire. Long before the organized armies of nobles were ready to march, a wave of popular preachers, most famously a charismatic figure known as Peter the Hermit, gathered enormous disorganized bands of peasants, minor knights, and pilgrims eager to set out immediately. This is what historians call the People's Crusade. And as these bands moved east through the Rhineland region of Germany in the spring of 1096, a portion of them, whipped into a frenzy of religious violence and led by figures like a minor nobleman named Count Emico, turned on the Jewish communities and cities along their path. In Speyer, in Worms, in Mainz, in Cologne, they carried out organized massacres, murdering thousands of Jewish men, women, and children who had absolutely nothing to do with any war against the Seljuk Turks and had no connection whatsoever to the Holy Land. Local bishops in several of these cities tried to shelter Jewish families in their own residences. Some succeeded temporarily, many failed. In more than one case, entire communities chose mass suicide over forced conversion or slaughter at the hands of the mob. I want to be very precise here because this fact gets abused from multiple directions in modern arguments. This was not official church policy. Decades earlier, a previous pope had explicitly prohibited exactly this kind of violence against Jewish communities, drawing a clear theological distinction between Jews, who were to be tolerated, and the Muslim armies the crusade was meant to fight. There is no reliable evidence that Peter the Hermit himself preached hatred of Jews. Church officials at the time condemned these massacres, but none of that stopped them from happening on a horrifying scale, carried out by ordinary Christians who had taken a vow to fight for God and interpreted that vow on their own initiative as a license for local ethnic and religious cleansing close to home. This is one of the most important and most uncomfortable things historians want you to understand about the Crusades. The ideology of holy war, once released into a society already primed for violence, did not stay neatly confined to the intended target. It found other victims almost immediately, and it would keep finding them for centuries. Meanwhile, the actual military expedition, the organized armies of nobles that Urban had envisioned, made their way toward Constantinople, and Emperor Alexios found himself dealing with something wildly different from the mercenary reinforcement he had requested. Instead of a modest contingent of hired soldiers under his command, he was faced with tens of thousands of independent-minded Western nobles, each with their own ambitions, marching through his territory with an agenda of conquest that was only loosely coordinated with Byzantine strategic interests at all. He managed the situation as best he could, extracting oaths of loyalty and promises to return conquered Byzantine territory, but the relationship between the Byzantines and the Crusaders was tense and mutually suspicious from nearly the very beginning, a mismatch of expectations baked into the origin of the entire enterprise. And here we arrive at the fact that perhaps most completely undermines the popular image of a unified religious war between Christianity and Islam. Because when the Crusaders finally crossed into the Muslim-ruled Near East, they did not encounter a single unified Islamic civilization braced to repel a foreign invasion. They encountered a deeply fractured political landscape that, in crucial ways, had no coherent idea what was even happening to it. The Islamic world of the 1090s was split by one of the deepest fault lines in its history: the rivalry between the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate, based in Baghdad and largely under the real military control of the Seljuk Turks, and the Shia Fatimid Caliphate, based in Cairo, which considered the Abbasids and the Sunni Seljuks its primary enemies. On top of this sectarian split, the once mighty Seljuk Empire itself had fragmented after the death of its great sultan in 1092 into a patchwork of rival emirates, centered on cities like Aleppo, Damascus, and Antioch, ruled by local strongmen who were frequently at war with each other over local territory and status, sometimes allying with each other against the Crusaders, but just as often ignoring the newcomers entirely in favor of settling old scores with their Muslim neighbors. When the Crusaders besieged the city of Antioch, local Muslim rulers largely failed to unite in relief efforts, partly because they didn't trust each other more than they feared this new and, to them, still fairly obscure force from the west. The Fatimids in Cairo, seeing the Seljuks as their primary rivals, at one point even sent diplomatic overtures to the approaching Crusader army, hoping to use these strange Frankish warriors as a tool against their own Sunni enemies, only to have that calculation backfire spectacularly once the Crusaders turned on Fatimid-held Jerusalem itself. This disunity is not a minor footnote. It is arguably the single most important reason the First Crusade succeeded at all. A relatively small, exhausted, disease-ravaged Western army, having lost a huge percentage of its original numbers to starvation, thirst, and battle attrition on the long march across Anatolia and Syria, should not by any conventional military logic have been able to conquer and hold territory against the combined might of the Islamic Near East. It didn't have to, because there was no combined might. There was a patchwork of rival princes who, in the crucial early years, frequently found their local neighbors, Muslim or otherwise, a more urgent threat than these unfamiliar and, to Islamic chroniclers of the time, only vaguely defined foreign warriors from beyond the sea. And this leads directly to another detail the popular story gets badly wrong: the idea that the Muslim world immediately understood the fall of Jerusalem in 1099 as a civilizational catastrophe demanding an urgent, unified religious response. It didn't, at least not right away. Contemporary Islamic sources from the years right after 1099 treat the loss of Jerusalem as a serious but regional political and military setback, not yet as the kind of existential religious emergency that would eventually mobilize the whole Islamic world. That framing, the Crusades as an attack on Islam itself demanding a coordinated jihad, developed gradually over the following decades, articulated by religious scholars like al-Sulami in Damascus, who began preaching almost immediately after 1099 that Muslims needed to set aside their internal quarrels and unite against the Frankish invaders. But it took nearly half a century for that call to translate into real political unity. It was really only under a ruler named Zengi in the 1140s, and then decisively under his successors Nur ad-Din and finally the famous Saladin, who extinguished the rival Fatimid Caliphate in 1171 and brought Egypt and Syria under unified Sunni control, that the Islamic Near East finally organized itself into a coherent counter-crusading force capable of retaking Jerusalem, which Saladin finally accomplished in 1187, 88 years after it had fallen. the clash of civilizations. Framing treats the conflict as though both sides entered it as fully formed, self-aware, unified religious blocs from day one. The actual history shows something much slower and messier. A fragmented Islamic political world that had to be argued, preached, and politically unified into a counter-crusade over the course of 2 full generations. Now, let's turn to the Crusaders themselves, and to a question that has genuinely divided historians for the better part of a century, because the answer that most people assume is true has been substantially overturned by serious modern research. For a long time, the standard explanation for why so many knights signed up was straightforwardly economic. Europe, the theory went, was producing a glut of landless younger sons, thanks to inheritance customs that increasingly favored a single firstborn heir, leaving second and third sons with military training, aristocratic ambitions, and nothing to inherit. The Crusades, in this reading, were essentially an outlet for surplus, land-hungry young men to go carve out fortunes and estates for themselves in the East, dressed up in religious language as cover for what was really an economic land grab. It's a tidy, cynical, thoroughly modern-sounding explanation. And the historian who has done more than anyone else to systematically dismantle it, Jonathan Riley Smith, spent decades combing through the actual surviving legal and financial documents, charters, land sales, and family records connected to the men who took the cross in 1096, and what he found simply does not support the theory. There is no clear evidence that younger sons were any more likely to go on crusade than older sons who stood to inherit everything. Going on crusade was ruinously, catastrophically expensive. A knight typically needed to raise something like 4 to 5 times his annual income just to cover the costs of arms, horses, supplies, and the journey itself, which meant selling land, mortgaging estates to the church, and often placing enormous financial burdens on the very families they were leaving behind. Very few crusaders who survived ever settled permanently in the new crusader states in the East. Most who lived through the ordeal turned around and went home, back to the modest estates in France and Germany and Italy they had so expensively endangered in the first place. What the documents do show, again and again, is families of substantial means pooling resources, mortgaging patrimonial land specifically, so a father, a brother, an uncle could go and fulfill what they described, in their own words, as a religious vow, motivated by genuine anxiety for the state of their souls, and a real, sincere desire to free the places where Christ had walked. This doesn't mean greed played no role for anyone. Once Crusader states were actually established in the East, plenty of later arrivals absolutely did go looking for opportunity in land, and looting captured cities was common practice. But for that first, world historically consequential wave of nobles in 1096, the evidence increasingly suggests something modern audiences often find harder to accept than a cynical land grab: mass, sincere, extraordinarily costly religious devotion. A set of people willing to bankrupt their own families for what they believed, rightly or wrongly, was the literal salvation of their souls. Which brings us to one of the darkest and most revealing moments of the entire First Crusade, the one place where sincere religious zeal and outright atrocity collided in full view of history. In July of 1099, after a grueling siege, the Crusader army finally broke through the walls of Jerusalem. What followed, according to multiple contemporary chronicles, both Christian and Muslim, was a brutal massacre of a significant portion of the city's Muslim and Jewish population. Exact numbers are genuinely disputed among modern historians, and some of the most extreme figures reported by chroniclers writing after the fact, describing blood running ankle-deep through the streets, are now widely regarded as rhetorical exaggeration, meant to convey the scale of God's judgment rather than literal statistics. But the core fact of a large-scale massacre of civilians is corroborated across multiple independent sources and is not seriously disputed by mainstream historians today. This was the triumphant, supposedly holy culmination of the entire expedition, and it was carried out, according to the Crusaders' own chroniclers, by men who reportedly went straight from the killing to weeping with joy at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Sincere piety and horrific violence were not opposites in this story. For many of these men, they were the very same act. Now let's fast forward, because the popular myth tends to imagine the next 2 centuries as one long, continuous religious war against Islam, when the actual history of the crusading movement is far stranger and, in places, far more self-destructive than that. There were, depending on how you count them, somewhere around 8 or 9 major numbered expeditions to the Holy Land over roughly 200 years, interspersed with countless smaller campaigns, and their record was wildly inconsistent. The Second Crusade, launched in the 1140s in response to the fall of the Crusader county of Edessa, ended in humiliating failure outside the walls of Damascus. The disastrous Children's Crusade of 1212, a popular, uncontrolled movement of young people and poor pilgrims that the institutional church never actually sanctioned as an official crusade, ended not in glory but in exploitation, with many participants dying of exposure and hunger or reportedly sold into slavery by unscrupulous merchants along the way. A grim echo of exactly the kind of uncontrolled popular fervor that had produced the Rhineland massacres over a century earlier. But if you want the single event that most completely shatters the idea of a clean, coherent war of Christendom against Islam, you need the Fourth Crusade and the year 1204. Launched by Pope Innocent III with the stated goal of striking at Muslim power in Egypt, the Fourth Crusade almost immediately went catastrophically off course. Deeply in debt to the Republic of Venice for the enormous fleet needed to transport them, the Crusader army was first diverted to attack and sack the Christian Hungarian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast simply to settle Venice's commercial and political scores, an act so blatantly contrary to the Crusade's supposed purpose that Pope Innocent excommunicated the entire Crusader army. Then, drawn in by the promises of an exiled Byzantine claimant offering enormous payment in exchange for military help seizing his throne, the Crusaders sailed on to Constantinople itself, the largest, richest, and most magnificent Christian city on earth, the capital of the very same Byzantine Empire whose plea for help had, over a century earlier, started this entire movement in the first place. What followed, in April of 1204, was one of the most devastating sacks of a city in medieval history. For 3 days, an army that had taken vows to fight for the glory of God instead looted, burned, and desecrated the churches of fellow Christians. The Hagia Sophia itself, the greatest cathedral in Christendom, was stripped of its gold and its sacred relics. Priceless manuscripts preserving irreplaceable works of ancient Greek and Roman scholarship, many of which existed nowhere else in the world, were destroyed or scattered. Historians estimate roughly 2,000 Byzantine civilians were killed in the initial chaos of the sack. The Byzantine Empire, the civilization whose distress call had launched the crusading movement, was carved up between the Crusaders and Venice, its wealth and territory divided among the very people it had once asked for help. It would eventually reclaim its capital decades later, but it never fully recovered, and it would finally fall for good to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, a city permanently weakened, in no small part, by fellow Christians. Relations between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, already strained by a formal schism in 1054, were poisoned for the rest of the Middle Ages and, in some respects, remain a source of genuine tension between Eastern Orthodox and Catholic Christianity to this day. If there was ever a moment that proves the crusading movement was never simply a unified war of one religion against another, it is the sack of Constantinople, the greatest atrocity of the entire crusading era inflicted by crusaders on Christians. And the Fourth Crusade is far from the only example of crusade being turned inward against fellow Europeans. Modern historians, following what's called the pluralist interpretation of the crusading movement, now recognize that the label crusade, with its specific package of papal authorization, formal vows, and the promise of a plenary indulgence, was applied by the medieval church to a whole range of conflicts that had nothing to do with the Holy Land or with Islam at all. In the early 13th century, the papacy called a full crusade, complete with indulgences, against the Cathars, a Christian heretical movement centered in southern France, unleashing decades of brutal warfare against fellow Latin Christians in what's known as the Albigensian Crusade. Starting in the 12th century and continuing for roughly 300 years, a series of campaigns known as the Northern or Baltic Crusades were waged by Danish, German, and Polish forces. Most famously, the military monastic order of the Teutonic Knights against the pagan peoples of the Baltic coast, campaigns that mixed genuine missionary intent with naked territorial conquest, and, in places, something approaching the near elimination of entire pagan cultures and languages. And of course, the ongoing Christian reconquest of Muslim-ruled Spain, the Reconquista, which had begun centuries before Clermont, was itself formally declared a crusade by the papacy in 1123 and continued to be treated as one off and on for the following 3.5 centuries, right up until the fall of Granada in 1492. The word crusade was never confined to one enemy, one battlefield, or one century. It was a flexible tool of papal authority that got applied again and again to whatever conflict the church of a given moment decided qualified as righteous, penitential war, whether the target was a Muslim army, a Christian heretic, a pagan tribe, or, as we've seen, another Christian empire entirely. So, pulling all of this together, what is the true origin of the Crusades? And what do historians actually want you to understand that the popular story leaves out? It starts not with religious hatred, but with a fairly narrow, specific request for military manpower from a desperate Byzantine emperor trying to save his crumbling eastern frontier. That request was transformed by a pope facing his own complicated set of domestic and institutional pressures into something far larger and more radical: a mass, penitential holy war explicitly designed, in part, to redirect the chronic internal violence of an unstable Western European aristocracy outward toward a cause the church itself could sanctify and, ideally, control. It was received by an ordinary population primed for exactly this kind of religious mobilization, and the enthusiasm it unleashed almost immediately spiraled beyond anyone's control, producing, before the official armies had even properly begun their march, a horrifying wave of violence against Jewish communities in Germany that the church had explicitly forbidden and publicly condemned, yet was utterly unable to prevent. It succeeded militarily against enormous odds, not primarily because of European technological or moral superiority, but substantially because it arrived at a moment of profound political and sectarian fragmentation across the Islamic Near East, a divided world that took nearly a century to organize a coherent religious and military response. The men who fought it were driven, according to the best modern archival research, less by cynical land hunger than by an intense, costly, and thoroughly sincere religious conviction, a conviction that proved fully compatible in the Crucible of Jerusalem in 1099, with brutal, indiscriminate massacre. And the movement itself, over the following 2 centuries, expanded so far beyond any simple war against Islam that its single most devastating act of destruction, the sack of Constantinople in 1204, was inflicted by Christians on Christians, and its longest-running campaigns in the Baltic and in Spain were waged against pagans and against fellow Europeans as often as against any army of the Muslim world. None of this is a comfortable story. It doesn't hand you a clean villain or a clean hero. It doesn't let the Crusaders off the hook for the atrocities committed in Jerusalem, or in the Rhineland, or in Constantinople. And it doesn't let the fractured Islamic world of the 1090s escape scrutiny either, or pretend that everyone involved on every side was simply an innocent, passive victim of somebody else's aggression. What it does is replace a flattering, simple morality tale, whichever direction that tale happens to be told in, with something closer to what actually happened: an extraordinarily complicated collision of faith, politics, greed, sincere devotion, institutional ambition, ethnic and religious hatred, both intentional and improvised, and the sheer uncontrollable momentum of an idea, once released into a violent and unstable world, taking on a life its own creators never fully anticipated and were never able to fully control. And maybe that's the real lesson historians want us to take from the true origin of the Crusades. Not a simple verdict about which civilization was right and which was wrong 900 years ago, but a genuine caution about how easily a narrow, practical request for help can be transformed by leaders serving their own separate agendas into something vastly larger and more destructive than anyone initially intended, and about how a righteous cause, once loosed among ordinary people already primed for violence, can escape every boundary its architects tried to place around it, and find victims its architects never even named. If you found this deep dive valuable, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And it's what lets me keep making these long, carefully researched breakdowns of the history most of us only half learned. And if you've got your own take on what really drove the Crusades, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.